A big week in South Carolina politics. We're going to talk about the legislation moving through the state house, the Epstein files, and the massive game changer in the race for South Carolina's next governor. Plus, a little later, we're going to talk to a Democratic Party chair about how they plan to win back the First Congressional District and why redistricting the 6th Congressional District might not be a bad idea. But the major caveat to that coming up a little bit later. I'm Nick Reagan, and this is We the Palmetto. We talked to Lowcountry voters. Trump was in true campaign form. Voting is officially underway. Joe Biden spoke here in the heart of downtown.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, well, let's start up at the State House. This week, a Senate committee advanced a bill that would effectively shield college athletes' name, image, and likeness contracts from public disclosure. On one side of the argument, South Carolina is somewhat unique in that those contracts are subject to Freedom of Information Act requests, and it does put colleges at a recruiting disadvantage. Opponents, though, they argue that as soon as the private money is received by the university, it becomes public and subject to public scrutiny and review. Governor McMaster, an opponent of NIL deals in the first place, has not yet indicated whether or not he would sign that bill if it does make it through both chambers. Meanwhile, data center drama has reached Columbia, now with state senators holding the first of several hearings this week as they consider a bill that would give the state more oversight on where large data facilities can be built. Among other things, the proposal also requires facilities to use closed-loop cooling systems that recycle water rather than drawing large quantities from local sources. And notch a win for Dorchester County Republican Representative Gil Gatch. His bill that restructures how judges are selected in the state has made it out of the House along party line votes. The bill does what a lot of people have been asking for by giving the governor the power to select the members of the Judicial Merit Selection Commission that appoints judges. Currently, lawmakers pick those commission members. The controversy under the current system is that lawyer lawmakers can effectively choose the judges that they practice in front of. Under Gatch's bill, none of the JMSC members can be legislators, and the spouses or family members of sitting lawmakers would also be ineligible. And up in Washington, the Epstein files continue to make headlines this week. Representative Nancy Mace, she got a chance to go to the Department of Justice to review some of the unredacted files that are not publicly available. Mace says that she did not get what she wanted, and she is now writing 4 different letters to different departments, different agencies to get all of the files that she wants. She's also developed a list of co-conspirators, a list of people that have information. She hasn't shared who's on that list just yet, but she has names and she is asking for additional information. She also says that when Attorney General Pam Bondi went up to the Capitol to testify in front of a House committee, that her performance was shameful, as Bondi did not answer all of the questions that were asked of her, especially in regard to some of the questions about how victims' names were released. And Mace says that she would love for Bondi to appear in front of a committee that she is in so that she can ask some questions specifically, saying that Bondi has a lot to answer for. Of course, Mace has been one of the driving factors in getting those Epstein files released, one of just a handful of Republicans that initiated that call in Congress. Now she's gotten some of that information. She says she is committed to getting to the bottom of the Epstein conspiracy, saying that there are people that need to be put behind bars. Meanwhile, big news, and possibly the biggest news that there could be in the race for South Carolina's next governor, Henry McMaster has made an official endorsement, and this could shake up the entire race. He is officially endorsing his Lieutenant Governor, Pamela Evette. Now, that is a big deal. He is the top Republican in the state. He is the biggest endorsement that these candidates can get outside of President Donald Trump's endorsement. It's unlikely that Trump is expected to make an endorsement anytime soon, but Trump has surprised people in the past. What we do know is that Trump loves Governor Henry McMaster. So McMaster throwing his support behind Evett could be an indicator that if Trump does get in this race, he may also land in the Evett camp as well. But again, we'll just have to wait to see if that happens. But this is a big deal. Everyone vying for McMaster's support. And now it's his Lieutenant Governor, Pamela Evett, who has it. All right, well, let's bring in our guest for today. Joining me now is Michael Frank. He is the chair of the Dorchester County Democratic Party.
Yes.
Thanks for coming in.
Yeah, excited to be here.
All right, so last week I had your Republican counterpart on, and we talked a lot about redistricting the 6th district. That's a big push for a certain segment of the Republicans right now in South Carolina. I think about Ralph Norman, for example. That's one of his big things. As the chairman of the Dorchester County Party, and that district being the 6th district being part of Dorchester County, Dorchester being part of the 6th, what is your response to all of that? Does that district need to be redistricted?
So I think I'd rather just talk about gerrymandering as sort of like a wider thing, right? My personal philosophy is when politicians win, voters lose, if that makes sense. And so when you have anything that's not competitive and politicians don't have to like run or work to win a seat, it inherently hurts voters. So whether it's the 6th, whether it's the 1st, whether it's anywhere in the U.S., when you end up in a position where districts aren't competitive, you end up in a position where voters are not coming out positively in that. Now, we can look at this state and we can talk about the 6th, which has been inherently sort of set up in that way. But let's also talk about the 1st, right, which is where we have coming up in a race right now. And 30,000 black voters were axed out of that under extreme partisanship per the Supreme Court, right? But if it's extreme partisanship and it's 30,000 black voters, if it's racist extreme partisanship, does that change the reality of the situation? What I heard last week that really stuck with me was nothing that CJ said was about what's best for voters. It was about supporting Donald Trump. And, you know, I'm not interested in what Donald Trump wants. I'm not interested in what's best for Jim Clyburn. I'm interested in what's best for our voters. And so whether it's, you know, making the district more competitive, sure, but if we're going to do that, let's make all the districts in South Carolina competitive. We are in a purple state that hasn't been purple. When you look at how it breaks down, true independence in this state is probably between about 10 or 15% of voters. But that never shows up in the way this happens in our primaries or everything else. We've had a Republican supermajority for over 20 years. And you know, you don't have the ability to do this. And so when we had a competitive congressional seat and there were 2 congressional seats, Republicans didn't like competitiveness. They didn't like voters being heard. And so they worked to gerrymander it. Now, what I will say, and I'm very vocal about these things, is if you look at the ProPublica report, we were complicit in that too. And so again, it goes back to, I don't care if it's red, blue, D or R. I want voters of all, you know, walks of life. Taxpayers fund these elections and they should have the ability to have their voices heard and they should have choices in candidates. We can't just run on a platform of the other guy sucks. We have to give compelling candidates that people want to vote for. And the reality is, whether it's these closed primaries that they're pushing for, or whether it's trying to redistrict things so that voters aren't heard, the primary goal of the Republicans here is to disenfranchise people and keep them away from the polls.
Okay, you said a couple of things I want to jump on here.
Yeah.
But in particular, you said that that we have been complicit in this. I assume you mean South Carolina Democrats have been complicit in drawing lines that have benefited or created part of this problem?
So based on the ProPublica article, when I read that report, from my understanding, the way that research was done and that article was written up, when the Republicans gerrymandered the 1st, they actually used some resources from a staffer within Clyburn's office. So there was some complicitness even within our own party in hurting our own ability there. I'm not saying that, oh, Jim Clyburn was like, secure my district. But my point being is we are just as privy to these things. Now, let's talk about where all this started, right? We can go back to Project Red Map and stacking and cracking and all the things that happened. When you go to North Carolina A&T and a historically black college and university is literally split down the middle and has 2 voting districts in it, there's a huge issue there, right?
Sure.
I mean, again, gerrymandering before was people sitting in rooms with pencils, and now it's supercomputers and algorithms literally disenfranchising people by the voter. We're in a different world, in a different time, in a different place. And in my opinion, the only fix for this is to have independent, like nonpartisan people doing our voting districts to make sure there's fair representation.
Okay, and what you're talking about, though, is the first district before the new maps came out after the 2020 census. The first district, Nancy Mace's district, was relatively competitive. I mean, I think Mace beat Joe Cunningham by like a couple thousand votes. It was a percentage, maybe 2% or something. And before that, he had beaten Katie Arrington, I believe, by like a couple hundred votes or something. It was very, very small. So anyways, that district was very competitive. And then after the census in 2020, they redrew the lines, made it a much more red district. And a lot of those Democratic voters kind of got shuffled into the 6th district, which made it much more easy for Clyburn to continue to win, even though he probably was going to win that district regardless.
Right, and so they
just stacked all the voters into one district.
And so that's what makes the entire premise of what was being said here last week BS, to be as safe for a podcast as possible. But let's also talk about that, right? Like, they went to the Supreme Court, stood in front of them in the Alexander versus South Carolina case, I think it was Alexander, and basically said, yes, we kicked 30,000 black voters out of SC-01, but it was because of extreme partisanship. So they did this, and now they're saying, oh, look at this district and how messed up it is, and it's the corridor's shame. Well, it's their shame.
Well, I just wonder if that district... I don't know that I'm going to get you to agree to this because as a member of the Democratic Party, but Clyburn's district stretches from Columbia down to Charleston and from Georgia basically up to North Carolina. It does stop short at about Horry County, but it's a ridiculously large district. I don't know that it is unfair to say that district needs to be adjusted. Is that a hot take?
Let's go back to what I said earlier, though.
Okay.
If we're going to do that, let's make all the districts competitive, though. But that's not what we're talking about here. When CJ was sitting here, what did he say? It wasn't, oh, let's make this a competitive state where every district is competitive, which is what's best for voters, right? When people have to compete, you get better representation for all people, right? I don't want red or blue seats. I want competitive seats where we get candidates that represent everybody, because that's where you get actual political progress. When people have to represent all their voters, you get actual political progress. And so that way, if it's a D or an R, they actually have to represent everybody because they're accountable to a diverse set of voters and they have to do diverse policy actions. Why we are in such a rut and everything is so terrible here is because, and I'm not saying that simply because I'm a Democrat, but if you look, like, statistically, we are bottom, like number 43 in so many different categories. It's because we have, monopoly in one party, and they don't have to actually do anything. Part of the reason I ran for this seat is I went in 2024 and I looked, and there was 15 different seats that weren't even challenged.
Yeah. I did a whole report on it ahead of the last major election in when Donald Trump was elected, and it was like, of House seats, the state House, the House of Representatives and the Senate, it's something like 80% of seats go unchallenged in the general election because they're typically drawn in a way that favors one party or the other, and it is the nature of local politics to be a little less competitive. But then you look at the school board in Charleston County, and the school board had 20 candidates for 3 seats or something. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but the point being is that it could be competitive. I do, though, want to talk about the first district a little more because you guys are fighting for it because Dorchester County is in the 6th and the 1st. You guys are fighting hard. You've got a bunch of candidates that are running.
There's a football team between two parties here.
Yeah, well, exactly. So I want to know if this might be on the nose. Do you really think you can win the first district?
Absolutely. Here's why I say that. I think if you look at one, we have a hugely diverse set of candidates. You have everything from a former Republican Navy admiral who was fired by the Trump administration that recently moved down here to a server in the food and beverage industry. I mean, we actually have, I heard CJ say we had a big tent. That was a very laughable thing to me on the GOP side of the house. But I mean, if you look at our candidate base, it really is super diverse and reflective of the full spectrum of people that you have out there. You have folks running on a platform about environmental stewardship and, working class issues. You have folks running on healthcare and fair wages. You have somebody who has actual law enforcement experience doing counter drug operations like myself. You have the only person who I really don't know a ton about just because he just entered the race is KJ Atwood. But I know he has like some business experience and a little bit. I need to get a little bit smarter on him because literally he just had that forum and I wasn't present for that. I was out of town. My wife is a mayor in Georgia, so I hop between here and there. But, it's amazing that we have this diverse set of people. And the only thing I worry about a little bit is, there's this historic kind of data penalty that out-of-town Democrats take. If Nancy LaCour is our nominee, I worry that it's a Herschel Walker situation in Georgia.
Sure.
That is the one thing that worries me, is that it's seen as like, oh, it's this Democratic plant from out of town. They're not connected to the area. They don't know the issues. But I think the other side of that coin is because she has those sort of former Republican bona fides, she may be able to pull those crossover voters. Yeah. They all have very compelling stories. I mean, I look at Mac DeFord, who has been, this is his second time running. And, the other thing I look about is the amount of work these folks are doing, going across the state, and they're not taking this for granted, right? Especially it was funny, prior to Nancy and KJ, it was the ma. Like we had ma, right. Myra, Mac, Max, and it's amazing. So you have, Myra Rivera Vasquez, right? I mean, a former, vice chair of the SCDP, military spouse, has great connections to the Latin American community in the state. I mean, there are very compelling people running for this. Now, given, I think, it is an uphill battle for us, but I also really think when you look across the way people are feeling about this administration, the way people are feeling about this state and the current state of things, and you look at our recent performance and even special elections, we closed a 15% gap down to 21 votes.
Yeah. Yeah, and before that on Dorchester County Council,
right, Peter Smith Jr.
Smith, yep, he took a seat from I would call him a pretty powerful Republican. Yeah. I think that was honestly just a case of Republicans getting comfortable.
I think it's bigger than that. And here's what I'll say is, in local elections, you need, and this is what when I talk to people who want to run or whatever else, especially when you're in a county and you're talking about under 30,000 voters, you have to get past the letter next to your name to be that first and last name on a book. Right. And so Peter Smith Jr. is someone who has been out there doing work in the community, serving his community. He has a reputation for being somebody who was doing the work before he ever ran for office. And so when you have that authentic credibility and they see you as first and last name, it's also why in some cases I know plenty of Democrats who voted for Sam Richardson for sheriff. It's not because, they're not true Democrats. It's because they knew Sam, right? It's about transcending the letter next to your name and being a first and last name versus the letter next to your name.
Yeah, Peter Smith is actually a little difficult to get in touch with, to get an interview with him after his election.
Maybe I can help you with that.
Well, no, just for scheduling, I got him, but for scheduling purposes, because he was so busy, he was talking about, I'm doing the back to school drive, and we've got the farm thing that we're giving food to the elderly. So anyways, he was just very busy, and I was like, all right, well, when can we pencil in about 30 minutes that we could chat? And I was very grateful to get that interview with him because it was very interesting to me to see a Democrat win in a pretty solid race, even though it was a special election. But I'm curious what you think needs to happen, because when the first is open, when we're going to be voting, it's not going to be a special election. People are going to go to the polls. It's going to be, a midterm. And what do you guys need to do to be able to just be honestly competitive in SC-01?
Yeah, so there's two things I think are really important. One, and I think you can kind of tell in the way I'm talking about even our primary, I think we need to have a clean, non-dirty primary. We can't have a repeat of what happened in the DeFord-Moore primary, where by the end of the primary, the people who were running had sort of torn each other apart and nobody wanted to participate anymore. And the bank accounts were empty and nobody liked each other. And, I'm just being transparent, right?
Sure.
You can't do that. The Republicans may have that very same problem because things are pretty nasty over there right now. I don't know if you've been watching, but they don't like each other. They're arguing about everything. So they may be in a very similar position to where we were last time around. But I think it's really important that we don't get into the factions and we don't get into the political infighting about whose candidate is better. We really have to move past that. I think that's step one. Step two is we can't burn everybody's coffers in the primary process. And once the primary is over, we actually have to have the funds there to go after and win the general. Beyond that, I really think we are at a space and time in this country where people are ready for something different. I think the message that we have to hammer home, and that is one of the things that I have made very clear in both my running for chair and sort of what I hammer home with candidates is, Republicans can't keep saying it's the liberals' fault here. We don't control this state anywhere. If there's a problem in South Carolina...
It's the liberals and the rhinos.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the rhino... I'm sorry, but what does that even mean, right? I'm sorry, but who are these rhinos, right? Who is the liberal Republican person that they're talking about, and on which issue is that, right? At some point, you have to take ownership and accountability for the state of the state, and that's my whole thing. Is they run these campaigns for so long on this idea of these fringe issues about whether it's trans people or immigrants or entitlement programs or whatever else it is, but where is the real policy that's actually helping or impacting South Carolinians? And it's not there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a lot of consideration among voters on the immigration issue, but certainly the biggest issue I ever hear people talk about is roads, infrastructure, and development. And unfortunately, those issues are not they're not sexy. The sexiest of issues. I did see though that Ralph Norman today or yesterday announced that if he's governor, his lieutenant governor is going to be the road czar, which I think would be. I mean, I like the title. It's a good title.
I thought they didn't like communism. Why are we having czars?
That's a good point. You have to put that to him the next time you see him.
Can I say something about these roads, though? I own an EV, right? And so I hear all these conversations about EVs. And I travel between South Carolina and Georgia all the time. We talk about usage fees and infrastructure and everything else. This state is a ghost town for EV infrastructure. And so their plan is to do a one-time EV tax or whatever else because they can't get usage fees. I thought Republicans believed in private business and public partnerships. Why is there not EV infrastructure anywhere in this state? Why are we not thinking about creative ways to do that? We have Scout Motors here. We have all these things that are happening. In addition to that, their plan for the roads here is to punt the infrastructure that they haven't been maintaining back to the municipalities and make them responsible for it. And so then everyone's taxes are going to go up. And, I mean, I can go on and on and on. But again, speaking of Republicans in the county I'm in, we have the worst funded schools, the worst per pupil funding, and all of this is because of the way the state does property taxes, and the counties can't do anything with their millage rate other than hit the businesses and your registration fees when you go to renew your car.
Well, let me ask you one more thing or get your reaction to one more thing on SC-01, because recently, earlier this week, I think the Democratic Party, I can't remember what the acronym it is.
DCCC?
Yes, DCCC, thank you. They have officially announced that SC-01 is in play for them.
Absolutely.
So what does that mean? Could that be more money? Could that be a more competitive race? I mean, does that matter at all?
I think it matters from a couple of things. One, I think, when we're talking about primaries, I think we're talking about that a little bit later, open and close primaries. One of the biggest things we have trouble with here is data, right? So I think that means we'll get better data and more accurate ideas about how to more effectively campaign and reach people and resources and that kind of thing. I think the other piece is the funds being able to flow in from a national party, because that is generally what we struggle with here. When you talk about the wealth gap in this state and how it politically aligns, one of the things we do struggle with in the Democratic Party is we don't have the big wealthy donors in this state. The money is inherently slanted to the red side of the aisle here. We can talk about the history of racism and why that is. And, I can go back to Denmark Vesey and a few other things and how this state is inherently, I won't go on a soapbox here in this podcast, but there is a lot of things in the way this state is set up that is inherently set up to disenfranchise lower income and minority voters. And so the reality of the situation is when you are on the blue side, you have an uphill battle simply from a finance standpoint, because the money is concentrated. Also, when somebody's been in power for 20 years, a business doesn't really have an impetus to go back the other side because the power structure isn't there. So if I'm a business and I'm thinking about what's in my best interest, I'm not going to donate to a blue side because I don't want to get penalized by the ruling party for, backing the other side of the aisle. And we've seen in this state how quickly people are on either side of the aisle to take people who make political stands. I'm a big believer in, at a minimum, my pure ask for any business is that you just shut up and serve good food and provide great service. Now, I would love...
Sounds good to me.
I would love if you share my political values, but at a minimum, just treat your employees well and provide good service and don't make your politics in my face. And so that way I don't have to worry about it, right? That's the standard. But, if you want to donate to the party or you have your own personal contributions, that's great. But the reality is yes, we have a money problem here. But that's also because of 2 decades of Republican control and the sort of retaliatory nature of the party when people don't back them.
Okay, I'm gonna let you explain your answer here in just a minute. But first, yes or no, should we close down the primaries?
No.
Why?
So this is actually an interesting thing.
Well, and let me ask this real quick. Do Democrats vote in Republican primaries? And do they do it in a number large enough to make a significant impact?
I would say there's probably occasions that they do, right? I will give you an example of a period of time in my life. So when I was in the military, I was a Florida resident. And there was a period of time where I thought I was a libertarian or whatever. And that's until I realized the idea of trusting corporations to do the right thing is a hilariously laughable idea. And that's when I became a Democrat. But I wanted Ron Paul to be the Republican nominee. Sure. And so I registered as a Republican in Florida so I could vote for Ron Paul. That was the one instance of doing that. The other thing is, I will tell you, this is why closed primaries are ridiculous. You know how hard it is to unregister for a party when you're a military absentee voter? If you look at my voting history in Florida, you would think I was a Republican. Never been a Republican. I didn't vote, in any of the primaries after that because I had no interest in voting for any of those people. But the reality of the situation is I'm a taxpayer, right? My taxes are funding these elections. I should have the ability to vote for whoever I want in any of those things. And so what happens is, it goes back to when politicians win, voters lose. If I don't have a choice to say, hey, there is somebody on this side of the aisle who I really like and I want to be my presidential nominee, I should be able to go do that, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. And again, if we were fielding great candidates, what happens is when you have highly partisan primaries, you get extremist candidates. We end up with the MAGA. We end up with, I think it's why we also end up with very milquetoast Democratic nominees and we don't get more progressive candidates is because, if anything, I think you're much more likely to get disenfranchised Republicans voting in Democratic primaries because they don't like Donald Trump than you are to get Democrats crossing over to vote for. When was the last time we had a moderate Republican candidate that any Democrat wanted to vote for?
I hadn't actually thought about the actual cost of the election. Yeah, I mean, I know that taxpayers pay for the election, but I never really thought about that as a reason why you should have the right to vote effectively. That's an interesting conclusion. I kind of like that rationale. That's good. Okay, well let's sort of wrap up here as we get closer here. I want to talk for just a moment about, because you brought this up when we were talking off camera. Let's talk for just a moment about hemp, CBD, all of that good stuff or bad stuff, depending on your perspective. Lots of bills going through the State House on hemp, CBD, THC, marijuana, all of the acronyms. What do you, generally speaking, what do you think of this? Where should the state go with this?
So I think we have to start with one thing that the Republicans are trying to hide from everybody when they talk about this. Why are we in a crisis right now of having to do something about this? And this all starts with the continuing resolution a few months ago to keep the government open. The Republicans at the national level rescheduled hemp to where if states don't pass their own policy, by the end of the year, a $12 billion legal industry that exists is helping farmers, helping small businesses, and oh, by the way, young people love and is keeping a illicit drug industry from really existing. Because when was the last time you heard about anybody getting busted for selling weed? To the fact that Alan Wilson is having to create drug busts of legal people's warehouses in the state because there is no illegal weed to go after. They created this problem, and now they're trying to fix it. And so that's like where I want to start at, right?
Sure.
This is a created problem that they are now trying to fix. And then there's this rhetoric of like, oh, it's well-intentioned. And, Greg Ford has these stories about everything else. But the reality is, what's his real motivation? He's growing it, right? If he wasn't growing weed, he would be probably on the other side of it because he doesn't have any actual impetus to do it. I'm not going to, question anything beyond that. But the reality is like from a real value standpoint, let's talk about the facts of the issue. He's fundamentally right. There's real medicinal properties of cannabinoids for anti-seizure medication. I look back to one of the very early documentaries on this for seizure control, where Sanjay Gupta had this amazing CNN documentary years and years and years ago where, my stepson has epilepsy. And so he doesn't need cannabinoids for it. But people have severe seizures. It's absolutely important for that. I'm a military veteran. The things that people use for PTSD, some of the other drugs and the way they impact them for sleep or other things like that, so much better. Non-addictive, non-habit forming. Also, let's talk about young people. Alcohol is falling out of favor. And so part of the reason all this stuff got rescheduled is it goes back to tobacco and alcohol lobbies worked really hard with Republican leadership at the national level to get these things rescheduled. Rand Paul was furious about this because Kentucky has a lot of hemp growers, but this was one of like Mitch McConnell's last middle fingers to everybody before he goes back into his turtle shell and disappears.
Okay, I've got two random questions for you because you sent me over your bio. It is the most interesting sort of bio that I've seen. Can you just kind of go just very briefly, tell me a little bit about your credentials with the military. What were you doing?
So I did 21 and a half years in the Air Force. I started out as an IT admin. I moved over to the aviation side. So I flew on electronic warfare and airborne intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft. Just to kind of circle into that, what I am seeing happening right now in the Caribbean is absolutely abhorrent to me. I have flown those counter-narcotic missions and done talk-ons of having Coast Guard cutters intercept drug boats. And I can tell you that even with the best of intel, as an intelligence analyst, it's not always a drug runner. And so for us to be summarily executing people in the middle of the Caribbean without giving them due process, what we would do is literally we would guide the boats in, they would intercept them, they would seize the vessel and do investigation. It's not always drugs. Sometimes it's cash. Sometimes it's any number of things. And it's not even always destined for the U.S. Oh, by the way, the people on the boats are not like hardened criminals. These are people getting roped in sometimes, or they're being extorted, or their families are held hostage. And we're just blowing them up in the middle of the ocean without due process. And so for me to watch this happen, I just can't express how heartbreaking it is and how much I feel for people who are being put into the position of having to do these missions right now from being there. In addition to that, I've done war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've worked with Joint Special Operations stuff. I've done Department of State support for... I've done a lot.
A lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Man, you took this in a totally different direction. I was going to ask you two fun questions. Now I don't feel like
No, ask me the fun questions. Ask me the fun questions. No.
Well, okay. When I was talking to one of my producers, and I was like, look at the bio here, and all this about the Air Force and intelligence and whatnot, and they wanted me to ask you about aliens, and I was like, I don't know.
Ask me about aliens. Yeah.
Well, okay. Are aliens real? From your experience, have you seen anything about that?
So I've never seen any aerial phenomenon that made me think like aliens were real. Now, I am a believer in this idea of, I find it highly unlikely in a world and a galaxy as large as things are. I'm very much in like the Neil deGrasse Tyson school of thinking of like, with universal expansion and everything else. Like I'm a big dork. I'm a big sci-fi and fantasy reader. I find it highly unlikely we're the only intelligent life forms out there. But I don't think that maybe anyone has, evolved to the point where we are. But it is very interesting to think about the fact that the way like sound and light and everything else travel, that if those things exist, the messages are sent and like might arrive to us. Hey,
a couple of years ago, Nancy Mace was up in Congress, and she specifically asked the people that were in front of her whether or not the pilots of the aircraft that the Air Force investigated were people or aliens, and I believe they responded with something like, "Oh, they're non-human biological life forms or something. And nobody seemed to care at the time. And so I've just kind of logged that in the back of my head. I don't know if that's complete. I mean, I can't remember the credentials of the folks that she was talking to, but I vaguely remember them being credentialed and thinking, oh, so I guess aliens are real, and everyone's just not surprised by it. So that's cool, you know. But
I mean, the reality is, though, I think if you look at history and you look at the history of like stealth programs and all that kind of stuff, I think the more likely scenario is the speed of innovation and what's able to be developed before people see it is the more likely scenario, right? What is done and created before it's ready for public release or whatever is probably the more likely thing, but. I don't know. I think it's one of those things is like, I have this joke. I say never assign to grand conspiracy what's better explained by gross incompetence, whether that's 9/11 or anything else. And I think that's really the thing, right? You know, if there are aliens out there, would they really be interested in us?
I'll be honest with you. I can't really think about it. I mean, I can't allow these kinds of questions to impact my day because, like,
I don't.
At the end of the day, I'm like, what does it even matter at this point? They either are or they aren't, and they're going to do whatever they do.
Yeah, no.
I have really no.
What was
capacity.
the other fun question?
Well, the other fun question, what you already kind of answered was one of the last things in your bio is that you do stand-up comedy.
Yeah,
which I think is wild that you are this military guy, this party leader, and also, by the way, on Tuesdays I do stand-up comedy down at the club or whatever. Yeah. So I was going to ask you sort of what's your like pocket go-to joke.
So for me, it's very much observational stuff like that.
Okay.
I mean, you know, there's always like the very like inappropriate, so like a baby seal walks into a club kind of thing, or you know, I mean, terrible, right?
Okay, but, I like
you
that.
know, but I mean, you know, there's again, it's about off-color stuff. You know, I'll give you an example of one I did though, because I like to make my daughter cringe as much as possible. So she's doing a volleyball tournament, and there's this like tradition where they make these fun little clips that they put on everybody's backpacks or whatever. And, you know, I like to make her cringe. And so she said, it said fun guy. And I'm like, hey, I'm a fun guy. And she just cringed, you know, ridiculously. But really the bigger thing I do is I use my humor as also a way to be very scathing and critical of the other side. Yeah. The politics of politeness that the Democrats have done for so long have made us victims of Republican bullying. And as someone who grew up seeing that, I think there's two kinds of people who respond to bullying. There's people who grow up to become bullies themselves, and there's people who grow up to bully bullies. I like to bully bullies.
I mean, comedy and entertainment has long been a tool since, you know, the Greeks invented it to criticize those in power and hold people accountable.
Yeah.
So interesting stuff. All right. Military, a party leader, a comedian, all of it wrapped into one. Michael Franck, thank you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Well, make sure you subscribe to the We the Palmetto podcast so you don't miss an episode anywhere you get your podcast. You can also watch the video versions online at live5news.com or on our streaming service on platforms like Roku. Just search for Live 5 News. And I do post clips of the podcast on social media. Check out the We the Palmetto podcast Instagram account. Leave a comment, send me a DM. I'd love to hear from you. All right, that's going to be it for this week. Thanks for hanging out, and I will catch you next week for another episode of We the Palmetto.